Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are 10 potential Echo cards that we might just see in the Witchwood. Now, of course, these aren't really cards you're likely to see. These are custom cards I created that I think explore the new Echo keyword in a pretty nifty way. Now, if you're not familiar with the Echo keyword, of course, we were revealed one real card from the Witchwood, which is Phantom Militia here, and Echo essentially means that as long as you have the mana, you can continue to replay a card. So for instance, if you had 6 mana, you could play 2 instances of this Phantom Militia, a bit like we've seen in the past with the card Unstable Evolution. So I wanted to say, okay, this one, Phantom Militia, is a pretty boring example of how you can use Echo, just playing multiple minions onto the board, but there are a lot of cool interactions that could occur in Hearthstone utilizing Echo. Things like where you have to assess essentially some risk reward, like, yeah, I can keep doing this, but it might backfire, or yeah, this is only good if I Echo. So I wanted to make some cards myself that explored this keyword in a little bit more detail and a little bit more creativity than what we've seen so far. Now, of course, Blizzard might be doing the very same. They might have just revealed a very simple Echo card to introduce us to the idea, and they're going to reveal cooler ones down the road. That'd be awesome, but we'll see how much my 10 custom cards that I'm about to present in this video actually match up with some of the ideas that Blizzard has as well. So let's go ahead and jump into this. These are 10 potential Echo cards as created by yours truly. Up first here, I have a new Druid card I'm calling the Gloom Bloom, a name I'm very proud of. And this would be a new 3 mana minion for Druid that's a 1/1 at its base, and it has Echo, of course, but it has a battle cry that reads, gain +5/+5 for each Gloom Bloom that you control. So this is essentially an Echo card that is not very good at a base level, but becomes really powerful if you're actually able to Echo it out in a single turn multiple times. So clearly here, the Gloom Bloom to start a 3 mana 1/1 is completely terrible. But if you're able to Echo it twice, if you're able to play 6 total mana worth of Gloom Blooms, then you get a 1/1 and a 6/6. That's a bit more like a reasonable card. Still not great, it's just a big time racketeer, a card that wouldn't be very viable and constructed. But if you manage to play this thing 3 turns in a row, or 3 times in a row, you'd get a 1/1, a 6/6, and an 11/11, all for 9 mana. And that's suddenly a big old pile of stats and a ton of different minions for 9 mana. So this is a card that really punishes you to hold it early, but becomes considerably more powerful in the late game, which in fact fits Druid's playstyle fairly well, because if you're able to ramp up, you can make your Gloom Bloom better faster. And I think this is the kind of thing, big bodies, that Druid would really like to utilize. Clearly still susceptible to some kinds of removal, and your opponent could deal with some of these, and it's just one of those cards that could also be a dead card in your hand sometimes, particularly if you're wanting to do other things with your turn. You kind of have to commit to the Gloom Bloom. So despite that potential insane high roll, there's quite a few checks and balances put into this card as well. So I think this would be a pretty perfect example of how Echo could be a lot of fun if it escalates and if it actually makes you decide when you want to stop echoing or continue echoing, which I think, by the way, Unstable Evolution does really well today too. It's not technically an Echo card, although functionally the same. It's really hard to know when to stop, but this one says, okay, you don't need to know when to stop. You want to go as far as you can. And you'll note, too, that if you somehow did this over multiple turns, and you even had just a 1/1 Gloom Bloom already on the board, that the next turn, you could suddenly do some crazy stuff where you get your minions to escalate by +5/+5 even faster, ending up with a 16/16 minion at the end of the chain. So it also puts some onus on your opponent to answer and resolve these things too, lest you happen to have the second one in hand. Cost reductions could also do some silly shenanigans here. So across the board, I think this would be a pretty cool way to see Echo. I'm not too worried about perfectly balancing the numbers here, or frankly with any other card. I can't clearly take a balancing pass or test these like Blizzard can when they make cards. I'm mostly focusing in on the ideas and trying to get the strategy and the mechanics correct, as opposed to fine-tuning and balancing these. So if you think it's overpowered, don't fret, just focus in on the mechanic instead. So up next, let's take a look at a mage card here. I'm calling this one Tragic Thistle, which you might note rhymes with Magic Missile, another name I'm incredibly proud of. This would be a 1 mana spell for mage, and it reads, deal 1 damage to a random enemy. it also has Echo. Now, you're going to look at this right away and you're going to say, well, that kind of sucks. 1 damage to a random enemy is not worth 1 mana. You could say a card like Avenging Wrath, for instance, doing 8 to an opponent's board. That's the same thing, but it's 6 mana and you get 8 pings, and that's still not even a great card. So why would Tragic Thistle be good? Like, yeah, you could do 10 damage to your enemy's board, but why would you want to? Like, who cares? What good would that do? It's so random, it would never accomplish anything. It's a lot worse than something like Volcano because it can hit face. It does less damage than Volcano, and it would cost twice as much mana as Volcano to get to the full value of Tragic Thistle. But, and there is a but here, start to think about the implications of this card with spell damage. Unlike things like Volcano or Avenging Wrath, which only gain +1 damage from spell damage because it says deal 15 damage. When you get spell damage, it says deal 16 damage. Avenging Wrath says deal 9 damage. With Tragic Thistle, that +1 spell damage would apply every single time you cast it. So suddenly, it would be deal 2 damage to a random enemy. If you got +2 spell damage, it would be deal 3 damage to a random enemy, and suddenly the scalability of Tragic Thistle becomes pretty enormous. It's pretty crazy. So even if you spent 3 or 4 mana on a minion with spell damage in the same turn, your Tragic Thistle with the remaining 5 or 6 mana becomes an enormous threat. And if you manage to stick a minion on a previous turn and you have all 10 mana for Tragic Thistle, that is bonkers good. You're going to be able to clear your opponent's board in no time and maybe even kill your opponent outright. Because remember, if there is no minion on your opponent's side of the board, if it's just the hero, this is basically a Pyroblast at its base level because it does 10 damage to the opposing hero. And if you get spell damage, then suddenly it's 2 Pyroblasts. So, of course, if your opponent's not playing minions in the late game where you could accomplish those sorts of things, they're probably behind anyway or playing a weird kind of deck. So I don't think that's a huge balance risk. But I really do like the interaction this card has with spell damage, because right now, there just aren't that many cards in Hearthstone that interact with spell damage in a really positive and powerful way. Usually it just does add that 1 damage, so you don't need or see a reason to run spell damage in your decks. Like, yeah, occasionally it pops up and it's valuable, but nobody's building around it outside of some silly Malygos combos. This kind of card would give spell damage just much more consistent value, and I think the way it interacts with spell damage is very, very fun and intriguing and new. So I would personally love to see a card like Tragic Thistle land for Mage. So up next, let's move on to a Warrior card here. I'm calling this one Forest Fire. This would be a new 2-mana spell for Warrior with Echo, and it reads, deal 1 damage to all minions. And of course, Warrior loves whirlwind effects, and this gives them a whirlwind effect that they can cast over and over and over again. And I like this for a couple reasons. It's basically... number 1, it could be used as a removal tool if you really need a 3 damage AoE. If you are desperate, you could spend 6 mana here to get a 3 damage AoE to clear your opponent's side of the board. But also you could use this offensively, of course, with all the Whirlwind Synergy cards available to Warrior. Imagine things, for instance, like Armorsmith and Frothing Berserker. Suddenly this card becomes nuts if you can get multiple Whirlwinds out of a single card. That's a lot of value, and right now Warrior has trouble getting a ton of value out of those cards. It's not always that easy, so that's a really neat implication too. But I think what keeps this card interesting is that there's a real risk reward again, and it's a bit like a Forest Fire. Like, sometimes we have controlled Forest Fires where you get a controlled burn and it's healthy and good for the forest. But obviously, if forest fires get out of control and they start raging, they can be incredibly destructive forces. And I think this card's the same way. It's like occasionally you might just need 2 or 3 pings or 2 or 3 whirlwinds to really set up your board positively. But if you go too far, obviously you're going to be hurting and killing your own stuff and killing your own Armorsmiths and killing your own Frothing Berserkers. So I like that aspect. It's like, yeah, I need to kill my opponent's 5 health minion, but I also want to use my Frothing Berserker. That's not going to work. So you have to find a little bit of a balance there. I did think about giving this card a condition where it says you have to use all of your remaining mana to cast Forest Fires. In other words, like once you start with your first Forest Fire, you're committed to go through it, the end of your turn casting only Forest Fire with your remaining mana, or at least until it gets to a point where you have 1 mana left, I guess. That's an interesting idea too. It's like the Forest Fire is raging out of control and you can't stop it, and that would also make it a little bit harder to use with Frothing Berserkers. So that's a variant that might be worth doing, but I thought this one was still fairly balanced. I mean, Frothing Berserker is one of those threats, like if your opponent leaves it on the board anyway, they're in a lot of trouble, and if you use your Frothing Berserker the same turn you cast Forest Fire, then your opponent obviously knows that they have a threat they have to address, and of course its health is going to be reduced. So I didn't see a lot of balance issues quite yet with Forest Fire. It felt balanced anyway, but if you're really hung up on being able to buff your Frothing Berserkers for whatever reason, then you can use that alternate version I thought of. But that said, I still like this mechanically, thematically. I think it's really cool. Of course, Witchwood is all about this forest, which is corrupted and evil and taking over, and a Forest Fire is the perfect thing to cut down all of those evil, corrupted trees. So I was pretty happy with how this one turned out too. So up next here, I have a neutral legendary minion, and this one's a little bit scary, I'll admit. Calling it the Spirit Healer, which if you're not familiar with World of Warcraft, anytime you die in the game, you basically spawn at a Spirit Healer, and you can choose to come back to life. So they're basically taking ghosts and putting them back into action, and that's exactly the kind of character I thought would be perfect to represent Echo. It's like, yeah, you're a ghost, but you're coming back, you just keep coming back over and over again at the Spirit Healer. So my thought is, if you have a Spirit Healer on board, why not give all of your cards Echo? And obviously, right away, some people are going to go crazy and say, oh my god, Regis, you can't give every card Echo. What about Lightning Bolt, Regis? You can do 30 damage with just Lightning Bolt. That's too good. And you're right, and that's exactly why I gave this minion terrible stats, and I gave it Taunt. So that essentially your opponent should always fairly easily be able to kill your Spirit Healer. And frankly, I think it's okay for some things to be really good to set up combos. Malygos is kind of the same way today. It's like, yeah, if your opponent is able to cheat out a Malygos or stick a Malygos, they can do some crazy things and they can kill you in a single turn. Those cards are okay to exist as long as they have checks and balances, and I think Spirit Healer does in a major way because its health is just so darn low, and it has Taunt, so it's not like you can hide it behind taunts. Now, theoretically, you could give this card stealth in a couple different ways, and shenanigans could occur there, but those are so few and far between that I don't think it would be a major problem. And of course, if you do manage to stick this thing and all of your cards get Echo, that is completely absurd, awesome result, and that's a super fun kind of thing to do in Hearthstone. So I like that. The upside here, the fun potential shenanigan levels are off the charts, but it still remains reasonable and easy to beat. So I think it would be a really fun card to see. It would bring a whole new life to Echo, of course, and thematically I think it fits pretty well too. So I doubt we'll see the Spirit Healer, but hey, I wouldn't mind it at all. So moving on, let's talk about my new Rogue card here. This one's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. This is a 2-mana spell called a Cold Light. Of course, these people have these torches moving through the haunted forest of Witchwood here. I imagine it's a bit cold, but they do have a light, and that might or might not be a reference to the card Cold Light Oracle, which is just now getting moved to wild format with the rotation, Hall of Famed, I should say. So maybe this could be a replacement for Cold Light Oracle because the effect reads each player draws a card and this spell has Echo. So essentially if you wanted, you could use this as a 10 mana card draw spell for yourself, but you could also use it to mill your opponents. And of course Rogue has a lot of ways to reduce the cost of spells, so you can maybe squeeze out even more than 5 in a turn using things like preparation. For instance, you could double prep a couple Cold Lights so you get those out for free, so you can maybe do like 7 at least in a single turn, which would be a lot of cards to mill for your opponent. And some people might say, well, that's way too powerful, but frankly, Cold Light Oracle did twice as many cards for only 3 mana, could also be Shadow Step, so people were drawing that many cards anyway with Cold Light Oracle. It was never an overpowered deck. It could be occasionally frustrating to play against, sure, but it was still well within the realms of reason as far as balance was concerned, and I don't think Cold Light would be any problematic either. It would bring Mill Rogue back a little bit, so people who enjoy those playstyles would have another spell, another option to do exactly that, and Echo would empower it in a perfect way. So I think Cold Light would be a suitable replacement, would bring back a lot of fun in a different win condition and an alternate playstyle into Hearthstone. So I hope we actually do see a Cold Light replacing Cold Light Oracle. Moving on to my next card here, this is Resist Corruption. This would be a Paladin spell, and it's also 2 mana, and you'll note that 2 mana is kind of a sweet spot, I think, for Echo, particularly when it comes to spells. I have a handful of 2 mana spells in this list. You'll have to forgive me there, but it just lines up so well because it's easily divisible into 10 mana. 3 can be a little awkward there. 1 mana often it's really hard to balance, so 2 just felt right most of the time. But anyway, Resist Corruption, as you can read here, would give a minion +2 attack and Divine Shield. So a bit like the card Seal of Champions that we saw previously in Paladin, but this one, of course, has Echo, which means you could cast this multiple times. So you could cast it multiple times on a single minion, but of course that would give you really diminishing returns because Divine Shield does not stack. Now, if there was a minion active on board, you could cast it, attack to break that Divine Shield, and then cast it again to re-Divine Shield minion. That would be awesome. Of course, you could also cast this across multiple minions, which fits really well with Paladin's playstyle, so I think it would be very supportive of some aggressive Paladin decks. Maybe too good. That's a discussion, again, for a balanced team. This is really more about creating the idea than it is trying to find a perfect balance. But none of those are actually the reason I made this card. The reason I made this card was to give Paladin a cheap, repeatable, targeted spell for their quest. That's right, the last Kaleidosaur, Galvadon. It's really, really hard to make Quest Paladin work, but a card like this one, or maybe even a 1-mana version, like you could just do like Adaptation, but Echo, that would be the perfect card to set up Quest Paladin. And Quest Paladin, of course, so far has struggled, but a cheap, repeatable buff, I think, is something Blizzard could and would do to finally make Quest Paladin work, because even if you drew in the early game, you might get 1 or 2 casts of it, and that really helps. But if you draw it, like, turn 6 or 7, suddenly you get 3 or 4, and that helps you push over the quest into completion, which would otherwise be hard because one card didn't turn into 3 activations on your quest triggers, right? So I think that would be the ultimate reason for this card. It might also be a little bit too good or playable even outside of that, so maybe just +1 attack would be reasonable since it's repeatable. I'll let you guys figure that out. But I think a card like this does need to exist for Quest Paladin to work, so I would like to see them use Echo to empower that old failed card. So up next here I have a new pre-spell I'm calling Crypt Mining, which might be a subtle reference to cryptocurrency mining, although the card doesn't really reflect that. I just thought it was a funny name. But this would be a 3-mana spell that allows you to discover a card in your opponent's deck and give it Echo this turn. So of course this just takes the priest mechanic of copying and borrowing stuff from your opponent's deck, and it gives it an Echo spin, which I think is pretty cool. Now, I did originally say this just gives it Echo, but I realized that could be pretty crazy and could snowball out of control pretty far. So I added the this turn to the end of the card. I think that helps keep this in balance a lot, because basically any cheap damage spell got crazy good if you were able to just save it for later and use the full 10 mana assortment. But when you cut the mana remaining in the turn down to 7, suddenly it makes the decision of your Discover a lot more strategic, because 7 is a weird number for Echo, right? 2 mana stuff would be kind of the ideal. If you pick something higher than 3 mana, in fact, you couldn't even Echo it at all. But that still gives you some important decisions, because sometimes if if this is played in control deck in the late game, you might not care if it echoes. You might just want their Ysera or want their Tyrion. And the fact that it could echo or not is totally irrelevant. Who cares? But you might also see that really high value 1-mana spell. You might just take their Power Word Shield and use Power Word Shield 7 times to draw 7 cards. So there's a lot of strategic value in the pick, which I think is really interesting. There's a lot of decisions to make and control you have over how influential that could be. Still, of course, some randomness, so there's not likely you're going to be able to abuse this card consistently. Occasionally, it might allow you to do some really absurd thing, but Priest already does that today. And of course, it plays right into Priest style of play as well. So I think this would be a cool way to add a sort of restricted or limited echo into the back end of a card instead of making Crypt Mining itself have echo. That might be crazy, but this would just be a fun new way to see echo on cards we have today as opposed to just echo on future design cards, which I think would be a lot of fun and pretty cool. So up next here I have a card which would basically be a Zoo player's dream card, I think. This is the Leper Rat, a 2-mana 4/3, clearly based a bit on the Leper Gnome, and takes some inspiration, I guess, from the card Succubus that's currently available to Warlock. But instead of discarding a card like Succubus, this is one that would simply do damage to your hero, a bit like Flame Imp. And I have tweaked the numbers on this card like 12 times, I think. I've given it different health, different attack. I've made that Death Rattle a battle cry. I have tried it at 1 and 3 mana. I don't really know what's right. I don't know. This one maybe feels a little bit too strong to me, because clearly a 4/3 for 2 is really good. And the Death Rattle punishment, which was intended to be a punishment, might happen a little bit too late. But my thought was essentially on turn 2, like, yes, this is a good play, but on turn 2, you can't utilize the echo aspect. So it has to be a pretty strong minion to be playable on turn 2. And as you move into like turn 4, again, pretty strong play. So you get into turn 6, like I think it becomes less and less good throughout the course of the game, because then you're just playing into more and more AoE, and suddenly it's like, if I play 3 Leper Rats on turn 6, that's a way worse play than something like Hunter's Lesser Emerald Spellstone, which obviously a fantastic card, but there's also a huge downside to the Leper Rats. 1 Hellfire, suddenly you've taken 12 damage from your 3 Leper Rats. They each do 3 and the Hellfire does 3, and it's like, oh my god, that was a complete waste. So I do think there's a pretty big drawback here and a downside. Maybe it should be a 3-3 just to keep it in check, because the 4-3 might be a bit too oppressive and Zoo could utilize it too well. Again, I don't really know. You guys tell me what you think on the balance side of things. Ultimately, what I wanted to explore here, and the real point of the video in the first place, was what happens if you have a card that's really good with Echo early, but the more you Echo it, the more the downsides start to pile up. And that's exactly what Leper Rat does. If you echoed this 5 times, suddenly you have 15 self-damage sitting out on the board. That's a lot. 1 AoE and your opponent's going to kill you. So you have to find some balance where it's like, man, how many of these can I risk playing where I'm not dead? And that's the interaction that I really wanted to explore with Leper Rat. So again, I apologize if the numbers are a bit off, but I think this would be a really fun thing to explore where you have to be really careful about how you utilize your echoes lest it just kills you. And I think Leper Rat actually captures that effect really well. So moving on to my next card here, I had to get a Rager in there. Starting off with the Magma Rager, of course, in Hearthstone and Thistle, you've had a ton of different Ragers, most of them 5-1. Essentially, Amgam Rager was a 1-5, and I thought Witchwood deserved a Rager too. So I made the 3-mana Miasma Rager here. And this card has Echo, and it also has a Battle Cry, which swaps the attack and health of your other minions. I wanted this to not just be a normal 5-1 Echo Rager. I wanted this to do something interesting. And I like the idea of this card and the way it interacts with Echo, because essentially, depending on how many of these you play, it really changes your board state. Only Miasma Ragers on board would still get changed quite a bit, but if you have other minions and on top of that, things could get pretty crazy pretty fast. So you play your first Miasma Rager, it's a 5-1. You play your second Miasma Rager, it's going to swap the attack and health of your first Rager, which makes it a 1-5, and you also have a 5-1. And then you can choose to play a third one as well, and then you have 2 5-1s and a 1-5. But depending on what other stuff's on board, you suddenly have to make decisions like, man, do I want to play 2 here to get some minions? Do I want to play 1? Now, I don't know that this card would see play in constructed format, so maybe the implications aren't really that important, but even in Arena, it could be a pretty interesting interaction too. And on top of that, I really like the idea of multiple minion swaps, or attack and health swaps, in a single turn because of their interaction with cards, for instance, like Flame Tongue Totem, or even Direwolf Alpha. When you have a card like Flame Tongue Totem buffing a minion's attack, what happens is when you swap the attack and health, that attack buff becomes permanently swapped into their health, and then they get a new attack buff applied. So if you have Flame Tongue Totem and another minion on board and you play 3 Miasma Ragers, you're going to stack up a ton of extra free buffs onto those minions on board. Now, clearly you might kill your Flame Tongue Totem, so you'd have to give it attack somehow too. Maybe 2 Flame Tongue Totems on board would be the exact example. But again, that's like a fun little strategic element you got to figure out. What decks could use this well? What decks want to flip stats? Maybe a Priest with big health totals could use this to get a free attack in and then swap it back to its high health total to get another attack in down the road with another swap. There's all kinds of fun, neat little stuff you could do with Miasma Rager, and despite the fact that it's probably a terrible minion as a 5-1, when you get that active Battle Cry effect, suddenly it might be playable and could do some cool things that you wouldn't expect, and it becomes an actually viable card. And then finally here for my last card, I wanted to explore what would happen if Echo got really out of hand and it just became a huge risk to play multiple instances of a card. So this is the Recursive Ghost, and clearly that might be a play on words with the word recursive. And this is a one mana 1/1, has Echo obviously, and at the end of your turn, it adds 2 more Recursive Ghosts to your hand, and it also adds 2 Recursive Ghosts to your deck. So you'll note a couple things here. Basically, that means you're never going to run out of cards because you're just going to always have an infinite supply of Recursive Ghosts, which might seem a bit like an anti-fatigue measure, and in fact, it could be. You'll also note that it could basically give you a free 1/1 to play every turn because you just slot in that mana. But of course, because of the way this card doubles up on itself, both in your hand and in your deck, if you're not careful, it's going to give you an entire hand full of Recursive Ghosts, and it's going to fill up your deck full of Recursive Ghosts, both of which means every card you draw at some point is basically going to be a Recursive Ghost, and every card in your hand is going to be a Recursive Ghost. And at the end of the day, having a handful of 1-mana 1/1s and a deck full of 1-mana 1/1s isn't that great. I think the only potential problem with this card is that it could be something you add one of to every deck in the game, just so that if a deck goes to fatigue, this could be the last card you play, and then you never run out of cards, and everybody ends up with a Recursive Ghost. So I haven't really figured out a solution to that just yet, because you don't want to have every game end, or at least every fatigue game end, with 7 Recursive Ghosts just infinitely attacking each other on the board. There are some major problems there. But I don't really think that's that big of an issue, because ultimately you're not going to run a 1-mana 1/1 in a controlled deck, the kind of deck that's designed to go to fatigue, because it's just going to kill your draw too much. I think it's a big sacrifice, even if it does allow you to go infinite. There are so many better ways to play and better ways to win games, and maybe there could be other answers to Recursive Ghost. You know, a Skulking Geist for 1-drops essentially could come along down the road that answers that if it were to be a problem. So again, I'm not going to worry too much about the balance aspect there. I just liked exploring this idea. Maybe there are better ways to do it. Maybe they don't add them to your deck. Maybe it just adds 3 to your hand, and eventually your hand is swarmed by Recursive Ghosts, that sort of thing. Just the idea that if you're not careful, if you do this too much, you're just going to have an overwhelming amount of stuff that's all garbage, and it's really hard to deal with. Almost a bit like Weasel Tunneler and some of that Weasel Tunneler Priest we saw in the past, where you give your opponent a million Weasel Tunnelers, except you do it to yourself for some upside of having a guaranteed minion every turn. Now, one thing I didn't talk about is how darn good this might be in Quest Hunter, because Quest Hunter desperately needs 1-mana cards, 1-mana minions, and this would empower that deck again, much like we talked about with our Paladin card. This could give Quest Hunter everything it needs to finally get over the hump and be a playable deck too. Would it be too good for Quest Hunter? Maybe, but remember, even in Quest Hunter, you're not going to be able to take advantage of Karnas's Brood cards if half of your deck is Recursive Ghost. You're going to draw that Recursive Ghost just as much as you're going to draw your Karnas's Brood, and that'll kill the chain and kind of force you to struggle with the actual win condition of your Quest Hunter deck anyway. So, crazy card. I don't really know if it works. I maybe went too far. There's a lot of problems with it, I think, but nonetheless, super fun idea to me. I like the idea of the feral gibberness of it, where it just can go crazy if you're not careful. So that's pretty interesting, and I think that would be really, really, really absurd to see in Hearthstone, and I would be a big fan of it just because of the shenanigans it would provide. So let me know what you guys think on this card too. And that said, that wraps it up for my 10 custom Echo cards here. I'm honestly pretty happy with how most of these turned out. Again, maybe some balance issues here and there, but I think these would be really fun ways for Blizzard to implement Echo. I think we'd all enjoy playing these cards. I think they would add a lot of strategic depth to the game, and that's something we always need. More decisions, more risk-reward, more deciding where the limit needs to be drawn to get the max value out of a certain thing. These cards all do that pretty well. So I'm curious what you guys think. How do you think these cards fared? What custom Echo cards would you like to see? What are you expecting to see? Share all of your thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.